War. War never changes.
Some kind of war junkie?
Gentlemen, you can't fight in here. This is the war room.
Welcome to the War 102 podcast, where we explore the doctrine, theory, philosophy, and history of warfare. I'm your guide, Paul Darling, and I want to share what I learned in nearly 30 years in uniform. So let's get to learning about the most influential activity in human history, war. Welcome to episode 73, Joan of Arc. Well, it's time to tell the tale of perhaps the most famous maiden, aside from Mary. Joan grew up in a small town, and she said that when she was 13, around 1425, a figure she identified as Saint Michael, surrounded by angels, appeared to her in the garden. Her visions included Saint Margaret and Saint Catherine, although Joan never specified. Probably Margaret of Antioch and Catherine of Alexandria. Those were the most famous of those two particular saints. Both were known as virgin saints who strove against powerful enemies, were tortured and martyred for their beliefs, not to be too flippant, and preserved their virtue to the death. Joan testified that she swore a vow of virginity to those voices. When a young man from her village alleged that she had broken a promise of marriage, Joan stated she had made no promises. Critical to the story, during Joan's youth, a prophecy circulated in the French countryside based on the visions of Marie Robin of Avignon. Therein promised an armed virgin would come forth to save France. Another prophecy stated that a virgin carrying a banner would put an end to France's suffering, and Joan implied that she was this promised maiden, reminding the people around her that there was a saying that France would be destroyed by a woman but would be restored by a virgin. In 1428, she asked her uncle to take her to the nearby town of Vaucouleurs. I'm sure I mangled that. Where she petitioned the garrison commander, Robert de Baudricourt, for an armed escort to the Dauphin. But she was refused and sent home. In July, her village was raided by Burgundian forces, set fire to the town, destroyed the crops, and forced Joan, her family, and everyone else to flee. She returned to Vaucouleurs in January 1429, and her petition was refused again. But by this time, she'd gained the support of two of Baudricourt's soldiers, who was the garrison commander. Meanwhile, she went to Nancy under the safe conduct of Charles II, Duke of Lorraine, who had heard about Joan during her stay. The Duke was ill and thought she might have supernatural powers that could cure him. She offered no cures, but did say, quit living with the mistress. Baudricourt agreed to a third meeting with Joan in February 1429, around the time the Battle of the Herrings during the Siege of Orleans. And their conversations, along with some other support, convinced, finally, Baudricourt to allow her to go to Chinon with an audience with the Dauphin, as the Armagnac king-in-waiting was known. Joan traveled with an escort of 6 soldiers, and before leaving, Joan put on men's clothes, which were provided by the people. She continued to wear men's clothes for the remainder of her life. The Dauphin, aka soon-to-be Charles VII, met Joan for the first time at the royal court in February or March, and she was 17. She told him that she had come to raise the siege of Orleans and to lead him to Reims for his coronation. They had a private exchange that made a strong impression on Charles. But Charles and his council needed even more assurance. They sent Joan to Poitiers to be examined by a council of theologians who declared that she was a good person and a good Catholic. They did not render a decision on the source of Joan's inspiration, but agreed that sending her to Orleans could be useful, and would test whether her inspiration was indeed of divine origin. Joan was then sent to Tours to be physically examined by women directed by Charles's mother-in-law, who verified her virginity. This established she could indeed be the prophesied virgin savior of France, to show the purity of her devotion, and to ensure she had not consorted with Satan. One has to be careful about such things, I suppose. The Dauphin, reassured by the results of these tests, commissioned plate armor for her. She designed her own banner and had a sword. Around this time, she began calling herself Joan the Maiden, emphasizing her virginity as a sign of her mission. After almost a century of war, the Armagnacs were demoralized. Once Joan joined the Dauphin's cause, her personality began to raise their spirits, inspiring devotion and the hope of divine assistance. Her belief in the divine origin of her mission turned the long-standing Anglo-French conflict over inheritance into a religious war. And before beginning the journey to Orleans, Joan dictated a letter to the Duke of Bedford, warning him that she was sent by God to drive him out of France. Joan set out from Blois as part of an army carrying supplies for the relief of Orleans. She arrived on 29 April and met the commander. Jean the Bastard of Orleans, and the future Count of Dunois. Orleans was not completely cut off, and the Bastard of Orleans got her into the city, where she was greeted enthusiastically. Joan was initially treated as a figurehead to raise morale, flying her banner on the battlefield, and she was not given any formal command or included in military councils, but quickly gained the support of the Armagnac troops. She always seemed to be present where the fighting was most intense, and she frequently stayed with the front ranks. She gave them a sense she was fighting for their salvation. Armagnac commanders would sometimes accept the advice she gave them, such as deciding which position to attack, and when to continue an assault, and how to place artillery. On the 4th of May, the Armagnacs were on the offensive, attacking the outlying Bastille de Saint-Loup. Once Joan learned of the attack, she rode out with her banner to the site of the battle, a mile east of Orleans. She arrived as the Armagnac soldiers were retreating after a failed assault. Her appearance rallied the soldiers, who attacked again and retook the fortress finally. On 5 May, she dictated another letter to the English, warning them to leave France, and had it tied to a bolt, fired then by a crossbowman. The Armagnacs resumed the offensive on 6 May, capturing Saint-Jean-le-Blanc, which the English had deserted. The Armagnac commanders wanted to stop, but Joan demanded them to launch an assault on Les Augustins, an English fortress built around a monastery. And after its capture, the Armagnac commanders wanted to consolidate their gains, but Joan had no time for this nonsense and wanted to keep going. On 7 May, the Armagnacs attacked the main English stronghold, Les Tourelles. Joan was wounded by an arrow between the neck and shoulder while holding her banner in the trench on the south bank of the river, but later returned to encourage the final assault that took the fortress. The English retreated from Orleans on 8 May, ending the siege. At Chinon, Joan had declared she was sent by God. At Poitiers, when she was asked to show a sign demonstrating her claim, she replied that it would be given if she were brought to Orleans, and the lifting of the siege was interpreted by many people to be that sign. Many prominent clergy wrote treatises in support of Joan after the victory. In contrast, the English saw this ability of a peasant girl to defeat their armies as proof she was possessed by the devil. After the success at Orleans, Joan insisted that the Armagnac forces should advance promptly towards Reims to crown the Dauphin. But before advancing, the Armagnacs needed to recapture the bridge towns along the Loire. This would clear the way for Charles and his entourage, who would have to cross the Loire near Orleans to get from Chinon to Reims. The campaign to clear the Loire began on 11 June, when Armagnac forces arrived at Jargeau and forced English to withdraw inside the town's walls. Joan sent a message to the English to surrender, which they refused, and she advocated for a direct assault on the walls immediately. By the end of the day, the town was taken. The Armagnac took few prisoners, and many of the English who surrendered were slaughtered. During this campaign, Joan continued to serve in the thick of battle. She began scaling a siege ladder with her banner in hand, but before she could climb the wall, she was struck by a stone which split her helmet. The Armagnac army advanced, and on 15 June, they took control of Mont-sur-Loire, and the English garrison withdrew to a castle on the Loire's north bank. Most of the army continued on the south bank of the Loire to besiege the castle at Beaugency. Meanwhile, the English army from Paris, under the command of Sir John Fastolf, had linked up with the garrison in Mons and traveled along the north bank of the Loire to relieve Beaugency. Unaware of this, the English garrison at Beaugency surrendered on 18 June. The main English army retreated towards Paris, and Joan urged the Armagnacs to pursue them, and the two armies clashed at the Battle of Patay later that day. The English had prepared their forces to ambush an Armagnac attack with hidden archers, but the Armagnac vanguard detected and scattered them. Remember, security is one of the principles of war. A rout ensued that decimated the English army. Fastolf escaped with a small band of soldiers, but many of the English leaders were captured. While Joan arrived at the battlefield too late to participate in the decisive action, her encouragement to pursue the English had made the victory possible. After the destruction of the English army at Patay, some Armagnac leaders argued for an invasion of English-held Normandy, but Joan remained insistent that Charles must be crowned king. The Dauphin agreed, and the army left on 29 June to march on Reims. The advance was nearly unopposed. The Burgundian-held town of Auxerre surrendered on 3 July after merely 3 days of simple negotiations, and other towns in the army's path returned to Armagnac allegiance with no resistance. Troyes, which had a small garrison of English and Burgundian troops, was the only one to resist. But after 4 days of negotiation, Joan ordered the soldiers to fill the city's moat with wood and directed the placement of artillery. And fearing an assault, Troyes then negotiated a surrender. Reims opened its gates on 16 July in 1429. Charles, Joan, and the army entered in the evening, and Charles' consecration took place the following morning. Joan, of course, given a place of honor, and announced that God's will had been fulfilled. After which, the court had a 15-day truce with the Duke of Burgundy, who promised he would try to arrange the transfer of Paris to the Armagnacs. while continuing negotiations for a definitive peace. At the end of the peace, Burgundy reneged on the promise. Joan and her army favored a quick march on Paris, but divisions in Charles' court and continued peace negotiations led to slow advance. The Duke of Burgundy began to reclaim towns which had been ceded to him by treaty but had not submitted. Compiègne was one such town. Joan set out with a company of volunteers at the end of March 1430 to relieve the town which was under siege. This expedition did not have the explicit permission of Charles, who was still observing the truce. Some writers suggest that Joan's expedition to Compiègne without documented permission from the court was a desperate and treasonable action, but others have argued that she could not have launched the expedition without the financial support of the court. In April, Joan arrived at Melun, which had expelled its Burgundian garrison. As Joan advanced, her force grew as other commanders joined her. Joan reached Compiègne on 14 May, and after defensive forays against the Burgundian besiegers, she was forced to disband the majority of the army because it had become too difficult for the surrounding countryside to support. Joan and about 400 of her remaining soldiers entered the town. On 23 May, Joan accompanied an Armagnac force which sortied from Compiègne to attack the Burgundian camp at Magnay. The attack failed and Joan was captured. She agreed to surrender to a pro-Burgundian nobleman, a member of the Jean de Luxembourg's contingent, who quickly moved her to his castle, near Noyers. After her first attempt to escape, she was transferred to another castle. She made another attempt to escape, jumping from a window of a tower and landing in a dry moat. She was injured but survived. In November, she was moved yet again. The English and Burgundians were quite happy she had been removed. The English negotiated with their Burgundian allies to pay Joan's ransom and transfer her to their custody. The final agreement called for the English to pay 10,000 gold coins to obtain her from Luxembourg. After the English paid the ransom, they moved Joan to Rouen, their main headquarters in France. But there is no evidence that Charles tried to save Joan once she was transferred to the English. With that, she was tried by the English and burned at the stake. Why the abandonment by the French king? Once Joan lost a battle, her aura and her usefulness were gone. Her ability to motivate and rally French troops was forever lost. She was no longer a God-given gift to save France, but just an ignorant peasant girl not worth ransoming, and not as if the English would have anyways. So what are the lessons learned? Napoleon, a fellow Frenchman, famously said, "In strength, the moral is to the physical as 3-to-1. With Joan invincible and seemingly of divine origin, the French felt themselves undefeatable and fought accordingly. It is one of the profound facts of combat that getting men to die is, in actuality, far harder than getting them to kill. And on home ground, the willingness to die is far greater. Once the English lost the momentum of conquest and the thrill of pillage, they saw death on a foreign land an unreasonable expectation, and perhaps Joan's French forces a divine rebuke to their foreign conquest, leading them to lose their motivation. Operationally and tactically specific to the siege, if you can't maintain a cordon, the strategy of starvation, which the English decided upon after the death of Salisbury, was impossible, especially after the loss of his Burgundian allies. Suffolk should have attacked immediately upon their departure or withdrawn his forces to defensible areas. Granted, all of these things happened within a few weeks, and Suffolk may have determined the same, but he didn't act upon this strategy. Siegecraft is a combination of patience and mass. If not of men, then it must be of heavy fires to break down the defenses. City fighting remains an issue today, albeit without the walls of medieval times. But it is only an issue if you decide to make it one. Sieges are brutal affairs on civilians, but city fighting is brutal on soldiers. It is an accurate statement to say that cities eat armies, both in attacking them and garrisoning them. Modern cities are far more sensitive in disruption to supplies from outside than their medieval ancestors. Armies planning to fight in them would do well to consider a return to the ancient art of siegecraft. Thanks for listening today. If you want to help the show, please share today's episode on any social media sites you can. Check out the War 102 Buzzsprout website for more information and to send me a message. And, of course, my thanks to the subscribers who help keep the show going. Hope you all join me next week. See you soon.